Borderlands 3 has a lot of weapons, like a lot. It launched with 190 different weapons, and through DLCs and add-ons added another 141. Naturally, as these 141 weapons launched after the balance changes and whatnot, they were oftentimes a lot stronger than the currently available gear at the time. And try as they might, Gearbox just couldn't buff all of the old weapons to match the new DLC weapons. In fact, there were quite a few weapons that were just completely forgotten about by Gearbox and the community. Hey everyone, I'm Constant Canadian, and these are the forgotten weapons of Borderlands 3. Before we start, I just want to ask, if you enjoy this video, then be sure to leave a like and subscribe as it really helps the channel out. Thank you. Starting off the list, we have the Ion Cannon. The Ion Cannon is a legendary rocket launcher from the Moxie's Heist of the Handsome Jackpot DLC. When this rocket launcher was first released, it had the highest single shot damage of any weapon in the game. On top of that, the Ion Cannon was also the only weapon in this game with a 100% drop chance. The Ion Cannon's high damage came at a price though. It had to be charged. But that still didn't stop it from finding its way into the meta for the first little bit there, even after Gearbox increased it to 6 ammo per shot and gave it a 5+ second reload. Eventually though, the Yellow Cake came out and made the Ion Cannon look like a kid's toy, doing far more damage. And not too long after that, the Yellow Cake also got nerfed. After the Yellow Cake got nerfed, the Ion Cannon was officially replaced by the Kick Charger. The Kick Charger has pretty similar damage to the Ion Cannon, except with a quicker reload and lower shot cost. And instead of needing to be charged to fire, the Kick Charger charges for up to 400% extra damage and can be charged instantly just by sliding. This meant that the Ion Cannon had pretty much nothing going for it aside from the 100% drop rate. The Hellshock wasn't always the powerhouse it is today. On March 5th, 2020, Gearbox gave this weapon a massive buff, increasing its weapon damage, then adding another projectile on top of that. This left the Hellshock in a pretty good spot, and it was a staple in every character's inventory as it was just too strong to pass up. However, with the release of the Bounty of Blood DLC, we got the Beacon, a very similar pistol with slightly lower damage. The Beacon, however, counted as splash damage and came in every single element, unlike the Hellshock that only came in fire and shock. That meant that if your build had splash damage bonuses, the Beacon became the priority Malawan pistol. That was until DLC 6 was released anyway. With DLC 6 came the Free Radical, a gun that completely broke the pistol, and hell, even weapon meta with its release. The Free Radical, while it was locked to shock, did so much more damage than the Hellshock that it wasn't even worth comparing. Plus, the Free Radical also releases homing bullets on hit, rather than the Hellshock simply switching elements when bouncing off surfaces. The Hellshock really didn't need much to compete against the Free Radical, just a small 25 to 35% damage increase. But Gearbox never gave it that, and so the Hellshock was left to rot inside of Vermin Lingua. The King and Queen's calls were so good at launch that really all you needed was them. As long as your accuracy was good enough to not run out of ammo, you'd be all set with just a Radiation Queen's Call. That didn't last long though, as just 2 weeks after launch, they had their fire rate cut in half. Now, I get what Gearbox was going for here, a slow firing but powerful hand cannon. But the calls didn't get a damage buff or anything with that fire rate nerf. This pretty much killed the King and Queen's calls though, as there is simply just so many more options that are way better than them, like the Maggie or the Hellshock. Even though Gearbox tried twice to buff these weapons' damage values by a significant amount, they just never really gained traction again. This makes sense though, because why would you want a pistol that does 69,000 damage 3 times a second, when you could just use the Rowan's Call, an assault rifle that does 61,000 damage close to 7 times a second. This is why no one talks about the King and Queen's calls anymore. Gearbox tried to make them a hand cannon without giving them hand cannon damage. This is kind of a relief though, as the King and Queen's calls were an absolute pain to farm, and, unlike the Lucian and Rowan's calls, could not be world dropped. The Brainstormer and Reflux, despite being locked to different elements, work in essentially the same way, so we'll be talking about them together. When you shoot an enemy with the Brainstormer or Reflux, it has a chance to chain to nearby enemies and split the damage between the 2 chained enemies. Damage dealt by these chains could also chain back to the original enemy damaged. This put Ties That Bind level sorcery in the hands of any Vault Hunter, albeit a little bit less brokenly overpowered. For whatever reason, the reflux does far more damage than the Brainstormer, to the point that even being locked to corrosive, the reflux is always going to be a better choice. But the true problem with these weapons is that Borderlands 3 is a game full of insanely good shotguns like the Butcher, the Anarchy, the Hellwalker, the Garcia, the Trevinator, and one more that we'll talk about soon, which kind of left the reflux and Brainstormer in an awkward place balance-wise. Sure, you could use the reflux and complete most of the game with it, or you could use the Butcher and complete most of the game in a third the time. The biggest downfall for these weapons was the patch that broke elemental source projectile duplication. For newer players or those who don't know, way back when Borderlands 3 first launched, any additional elemental damage type you dealt, be it through action skill and anointments or your skill tree, would duplicate any ricocheted projectiles. So instead of ricocheting 2 bullets, the Rowan's Call would ricochet 4 bullets, with the duplicated projectile going through the entire damage formula again. This exploit included the Brainstormer and refluxes too, duplicating the chains, which made it incredibly good. But when Gearbox finally got around to patching that glitch, the Brainstormer and reflux fell into obscurity, never to be remembered again, until today. The projectile recursion took the community by storm. Upon hitting an enemy, the projectile recursion's projectiles would ricochet to nearby enemies. This weapon was insanely powerful in the hands of Amara, as thanks to the bug we just talked about, Amara could duplicate the projectile recursion's projectiles a whole bunch of times through infusion and action skill and anointments, which wreaked absolute havoc on the battlefield. However, once that bug got patched, the projectile recursion just wasn't as fun as it used to be, even with its ricochet cap increased to 7. The Dictator was one of Borderlands 3's original bullet storm weapons. The Dictator fires 3 bullets in a horizontal spread, but when it's in bipod mode, it shoots 7 bullets instead. This weapon was incredibly powerful on bottomless mags MOs, and for a while there after launch was a staple in a lot of characters' inventories. It wasn't absolutely mind-blowing, but it was a strong, capable weapon that worked with basically anybody. That was up until April 23rd, 2020. With the release of Mayhem 2.0, Gearbox introduced Mayhem 6 Plus exclusive weapons. One of those weapons was the Monarch. The Monarch is practically the exact same deal, only stronger. The Monarch, rather than fire 3 and 7, would fire 4 and 8 in bipod mode. That's the only difference between the Monarch and the Dictator aside from damage. This has always been so weird for me that Gearbox just took the Dictator and increased the projectile count, then called it a new gun. Naturally, the Monarch is going to be better than the Dictator in every situation, as it's just a buffed version of that weapon, which now has no place after Mayhem 6. The 7th Sense was first introduced with the Guns, Love, and Tentacles DLC. Now there is an epic 7th Sense as well, but here we are talking about the legendary version. The 7th Sense is a mission reward for quite possibly one of the best side quest lines in the franchise. It's also got a pretty unique and interesting special effect. Every time you hit an enemy, a projectile spawns that kind of just wanders around above that enemy. Upon reloading, all of those projectiles that you spawned slam down into the initial target for big damage. The biggest downfall for this gun is that it is unanointable. Being unable to have anointments makes pretty much any weapon way worse. Plus, it doesn't help that the 7th Sense is acquired in the same DLC as the Anarchy, Unseen Threat, the Skull Masher, and the Soul Render, which made it fly pretty far under the radar. Which sucks because the 7th Sense was a super cool concept, it just didn't have enough damage to be used later on in the game. The Alchemist is a really cool concept that, at launch, was an absolutely formidable weapon. The Alchemist is a legendary Torgue assault rifle that upon firing would shoot a gyrojet and shock the player just a little bit. This was a pretty fair trade-off because at the time, the Alchemist's damage was pretty strong and was capable of deleting Grave Ward with little to no effort, especially considering that back then, the Transformer was one of the meta shields, so the shock damage wouldn't do anything to you anyway. The Alchemist is one of the items on this list that I truly believe was just forgotten about, not only by the players, but also by Gearbox, as somehow in the absolute gallon of buffs they were rolling out, the Alchemist, a gun that's been around since the beginning, mind you, managed to get a measly 25% buff in October of 2019, just a month after the game launched. The Crossroad was at one point one of the strongest weapons in this game. The Crossroad is a burst fire bullet storm Hyperion SMG that shoots in 6 round bursts with very short delay between rounds. Originally, the Crossroad fired 4 bullets per shot, meaning 24 bullets per trigger pull. With its moderately high accuracy, most of those bullets would hit the enemies you were aiming at. However, in the same patch that the Alchemist was buffed, Gearbox took away one of the projectiles and tanked the accuracy of the Crossroad. Initially, this didn't hurt the Crossroad too bad, and it was still performing even at Mayhem 3, the maximum at the time. However, this nerf happened all the way back in October 2019, before Mayhem 4 and before Mayhem 5 through 11. And as enemy health continued to climb in this game, the Crossroad damage just never did, only ever getting a small 50% buff to its damage. That small buff wasn't even close to enough, and considering they already took away an entire projectile when they first nerfed it, it was more like a 12.5% damage buff to its original stats, which with 12,500% extra enemy health just wasn't gonna cut it, leaving this gun to be yet another worthless legendary in Borderlands 3. Remember how I said the Crossroad was one of the strongest weapons in the game? Well, the Cutsman was the strongest weapon in the game, up until it was nerfed on, you guessed it, October 17th, 2019. Noticing the pattern here? The Cutsman is a Maliwan SMG that would shoot 2 energy orbs attached by a horizontal beam. This beam had its own little bore effect built in and could hit the same enemy multiple times in one go, especially on larger bosses with big hitboxes. Despite this smallish size magazine and inherent Maliwan weapon charge time, the Cutsman was an absolute perfect weapon for any of the 4 Volt Hunters. At one point, this weapon could solo true Maliwan takedown before there was even a choice. So clearly the nerf didn't hurt the Cutsman too much. However, clearly Gearbox got sick of this gun being the center of attention for every single build video out there, as the only other change to it was a 20% damage buff, not even enough to bring it back to its launch state. On top of that, Gearbox also released the DNA as a Mayhem 6 exclusive drop, which shot similar projectiles to the Cutsman, just vertical instead of horizontal, and the projectiles would cycle through the elements as you fired. Gearbox then decided to buff the crap out of the DNA while leaving the Cutsman sad by itself in a corner, just remembering what it used to be. How many of these weapons did you completely forget about until watching this video? And are there any weapons that you think I may have forgotten about myself? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you all so much for watching and have a fantastic day.